crystal chandeliers in the grand bohemian ballroom didn't just provide light, they felt like they were vibrating at a frequency designed to humiliate men like me. I stood in the back, tucked into a corner so dark it felt like a shadow was the only thing I was allowed to inhabit. My hands, the hands of a man who had spent 40 years wrestling with heavy machinery at the Champion Mill, felt like lead weights at my sides. No matter how much I'd scrubbed them with industrial pumice over the last week, the grease seemed to have made a permanent home in the deep lines of my palms. It was a map of a life I'd lived for my children. And tonight, I realized it was a map to a place they never wanted to visit again. I adjusted the collar of my new suit, a $300 charcoal wool ensemble that had cost me 30% of my emergency savings. I'd bought it thinking it would be a bridge, a way to show my son, Ryan, that I could fit into the high-flying world he'd built in Asheville's corporate offices. I didn't know then that the suit wasn't a bridge at all. It was a shroud for the man I used to be. The room was filled with the scent of expensive lavender and cold champagne, a far cry from the honest tang of motor oil and sawdust that usually clung to my clothes. I watched Ryan through the crowd. At 42, he looked exactly like the man I'd hoped he'd become: polished, powerful, and respected. He was standing with Charles Beaumont, his father-in-law, a man whose skin looked like it had been cured in a humidor and whose smile never quite reached his eyes. They were laughing about something involving interest rates and market pivots, words that felt like a foreign language to a retired foreman. I reached into my breast pocket and felt the sharp corner of a velvet box. Inside was a gold-nibbed pen set, engraved with the words, "To Ryan, with pride, built on the foundation of your father's hands." I'd spent 2 weeks' pension on it, thinking it would be the ultimate peace offering after 4 years of a silence that had grown thicker than the mountain fog. I'd imagined him opening it, looking at my calloused hands, and finally acknowledging that the foundation wasn't just a metaphor. It was the double shifts I'd worked to pay for his MBA. It was the life insurance money from his mother, Mary, that I'd handed over without a second thought so he could start his life debt-free. But as the lights dimmed and the string quartet faded into a hushed silence, the foundation was about to be demolished in front of 80 of Asheville's elite. Ryan stepped up to the podium, the spotlight catching the silver at his temples. He looked every bit the senior director. The room erupted in applause, and I felt a swell of pride so intense it almost made the tight collar of my suit worth it. I leaned forward, ready for the moment he'd look toward the back, toward table Muitam, and see me. "I want to start tonight by talking about leadership." Ryan's voice boomed through the speakers, smooth and practiced. "They say you are the product of the environment that raised you. And looking around this room, I see the man who truly made this promotion possible. The man who showed me what it means to lead with vision, not just with a wrench." My heart hammered against my ribs. I actually began to stand, my hand moving instinctively toward that velvet box. I thought this was it. I thought the 4-year banishment was over. "Charles Beaumont," Ryan continued, turning his gaze away from the back of the room and fixing it on the man in the front row. "You didn't just give me a seat at the table. You gave me the fatherly guidance I lacked. You showed me that success isn't about how hard you work your hands, but how sharp you keep your mind. You raised me in the ways of this world when I was just a boy with potential but no roadmap. Thank you for being the father I actually needed to become the man I am tonight." The applause was thunderous. It felt like a physical blow, a wave of noise that pushed me back into my cold metal chair. I sat there, frozen, as Charles Beaumont stood up to embrace my son. They looked like a match set, 2 pillars of a world built on the erasure of men like me. The silence that followed in my own head was deafening. I looked down at the velvet box in my hand, and for the first time I saw it for what it was, a pathetic attempt to buy back a seat at a table that had already been sold for parts. I didn't wait for the dinner service. I didn't wait for the forced handshakes or the pitying glances from my daughter Sarah, who was sitting at the VIP table and hadn't looked toward the back once. I stood up and navigated the sea of designers and executives, my boots the only thing I hadn't replaced, sounding like gunshots against the polished marble floor. I was halfway to the exit when I felt a firm, cold hand on my arm. It was Jen, Ryan's wife. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my first 3 trucks combined, and her smile was as sharp as a razor blade. "Frank, you're not leaving, are you?" she whispered, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness that made my skin crawl. The board members were so curious about Ryan's colorful background. It would be such a shame if you left before they got a chance to see the Rustic charm he grew up with. Rustic charm, I repeated, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. Is that what you call 40 years of grease and sweat, Jen? Is that what paid for that dress? Her smile didn't falter, but her grip tightened. We're just trying to manage the optics, Frank. Ryan has a certain image to maintain now. Having you linger at the back was a courtesy. Don't make it a liability. If you leave now, it just proves what Ryan told the board, that your mental decline has made you unpredictable. The air in the lobby felt thinner than the air at the top of Mount Mitchell. I looked her in the eye, and for a split second, I saw the truth. This wasn't just Ryan's ambition. This was a coordinated liquidation of my existence. They weren't just hiding me. They were building a narrative that I was a burden, a man losing his grip on reality, to justify the fact that they hadn't called in 4 years. Unpredictable, I whispered. You haven't seen unpredictable yet, Jen. I pulled my arm away and pushed through the heavy oak doors. The cold February air hit me like a bucket of ice water, but it felt honest. I walked past the line of 6-figure Porsches and Mercedes, my breath coming in ragged hitches. When I reached the valet stand, I handed the young man my ticket. He looked at the peeling paint on my Motngin Chin Chum Chin Muitam Ford truck as it was brought around, then looked at my expensive suit with a mix of pity and confusion. You're Sullivan, right? The valet asked, his voice low. I used to be, I said, climbing into the cab. As I pulled out of the Grand Bohemian's cobblestone drive, I looked in the rearview mirror. The hotel glowed like a golden cage, and for a moment, I felt the crushing weight of 70 years of doing the right thing. I'd been the hero of their childhood, the man who fixed their toys and paid their tuition, and now I was just the Sullivan stench they were trying to wash off. The drive back to my small house in Asheville was a blur of taillights and mountain shadows. I felt a strange, cold cauterization happening inside me. The man who had been hurt at the gala, the father who was waiting for a crumb of respect, was dying. In his place, the foreman was clocking back in. I pulled into my gravel driveway and saw a white Mercedes parked 3 houses down. Its headlights were dark, but I could see the silhouette of a driver inside. It wasn't Ryan. It was too late for that. I walked into my house and didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew every creak in these floorboards because I'd laid them myself. I walked straight to the kitchen, where a single cream-colored envelope was sitting on the counter. It was the invitation to the gala, the one that had started this whole nightmare. I turned it over and saw something I'd missed in my excitement to see my son. On the back, in tiny, almost invisible print, was a series of handwritten numbers. I recognized the loopy script immediately. It was Sarah's. It wasn't a phone number. It was a set of dates and dollar amounts. June 12, 35, August 4, 12, October 19, 50. I felt the room tilt. Those weren't just random numbers. Those were the exact dates of the withdrawals I'd made from my emergency savings over the last decade, the money I thought I'd spent on Mary's medical bills and Ryan's business ventures. But the totals didn't match my records. Not even close. I walked to my desk and pulled out my old ledger, the one I'd kept in the safe since Motngin Chin Chum Chin Mui Lam. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely turn the pages. I compared the numbers on the back of the invitation to the bank statements I'd filed away. The withdrawals were real, but I hadn't made them. Someone had been systematically siphoning money out of my accounts for years, using my grief over Mary and my pride in Ryan to mask the theft. And based on the notes on the back of that invitation, my children weren't just beneficiaries of my hard work. They were the architects of my ruin. Suddenly the front door rattled, a heavy rhythmic pounding that sounded like a demand rather than a request. Frank, it's the county sheriff. We've received a request for a wellness check from your son. He's concerned you might be a danger to yourself. I looked at the ledger, then at the velvet box with the gold pen, and finally at the shadows dancing on my wall. They weren't waiting for me to fade away. They were coming to take the house while I was still breathing. I didn't answer the door. Instead, I walked to the basement stairs. There was one machine in this house my children had forgotten about, a heavy-duty industrial shredder I'd brought home from the mill years ago. But I wasn't going to shred the evidence. I was going to use it to build a different kind of foundation. As the sheriff's voice grew louder outside, I realized I hadn't just lost a son tonight. I'd gained an enemy, and the foreman never leaves a job site until the mess is cleaned up. Frank Sullivan, open the door. I ignored him. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 20 years. A number for a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a polished image, brick by brick. "Earl," I said, my voice as cold as the mountain steel I'd worked with my whole life. "The machines are failing. I need a forensic audit, and I need it before the sun comes up." I didn't know it yet, but the man who walked into that gala was a father. The man who was about to walk out of this house was a consequence. The pounding on the door didn't stop, but my heart had finally found a steady, rhythmic beat. It was the same rhythm I used to feel when a massive turbine at the mill started to vibrate out of sync, a calm, focused alertness. You don't panic when a machine is about to blow. You look for the shut-off valve. I tucked the ledger under my arm and walked toward the front hallway, passing the mirror in the foyer. I caught a glimpse of myself. A 70-year-old man in a high-end suit, looking like a discarded king. I reached up and ripped the silk tie from my neck, tossing it onto the floor. I didn't need the costume anymore. The performance was over. "Sheriff Miller, I assume," I said, my voice carrying through the heavy oak door with the authority of a man who used to command a floor of 300 workers. I didn't open it yet. I needed a second to steady the rage. "Frank, is that you?" Ryan called. "Said you had some kind of episode at the hotel. Said you were talking out of your head and drove off like a madman. Just open up so we can see you're okay, buddy." I knew Miller. We'd coached Little League together 20 years ago. He was a good man, but he was being used as a weapon, a blunt instrument in my son's quest to have me declared incompetent. If I opened that door and looked as shaken as I felt, he'd have me in the back of a cruiser for my own protection before the moon moved an inch. That was the plan. Get me in a psych ward for 48 hours, and by the time I got out, the locks on this house would be changed and the power of attorney would be locked tight in Ryan's briefcase. I took a deep breath, smoothed my hair, and opened the door. I didn't swing it wide. I stood in the gap, leaning against the frame with a casual, tired posture. "Sorry for the delay, Jim. I was just getting out of this monkey suit. It's been a long night, and my feet are killing me." Miller looked me up and down, his eyes scanning for the maniac Ryan had described. He saw a tired old man with clear eyes and a steady hand. "Ryan sounded pretty worked up, Frank. Said you made some threats." "Threats?" I let out a dry, hollow laugh. "Jim, I stood up and left a party because I realized I wasn't wanted. I think my son is just embarrassed that his blue-collar father didn't fit the decor at the Grand Bohemian. He's always had a flair for the dramatic when things don't go his way. You know how he was on the mound in high school, one bad pitch, and the world was ending." Miller chuckled, the tension leaving his shoulders. He knew Ryan's temper. "Yeah, I remember. Look, as long as you're okay, I'll tell him I checked in and you're just sleeping it off. You sure you don't need anything? Just a long sleep and a lot less family drama, Jim. Thanks for looking out." I closed the door and waited until I heard the cruiser's tires crunching back down the gravel driveway. The moment the sound faded, the strength left my legs. I sank onto the bench in the hallway, the ledger heavy in my lap. I didn't know it yet, but that wellness check was only the first shot in a war that had been brewing for over a decade. The betrayal hadn't started at the gala. It had started in the quiet corners of my own home, fueled by the very love I thought was keeping us together. I thought back to the year Mary died. That was the turning point, the moment the vultures started circling. I remembered sitting at this very kitchen table, my eyes red and my head spinning from the funeral arrangements. Sarah, my sweet daughter, had been the one to bring the tea. She was the interior designer, the one with the eye for detail. She'd sat across from me, her hand over mine, whispering about how she and Ryan would handle the burdens of the estate so I could grieve in peace. "Dad," she'd said, her voice like honey, "you're so overwhelmed. Let us take care of the banking and the insurance. We just want you to focus on Mom's memory." I'd been so grateful. I thought I was being supported. I didn't realize I was being liquidated. I remembered signing those papers, the power of attorney for emergencies, thinking it was a safety net. I didn't know I was handing them the shears to my own wool. The phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't look at it. I knew it was Ryan, or Jen, or Sarah, calling to see if the sheriff had successfully caged the old lion. I walked into the kitchen and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. There was a crawl space in the back of the pantry that hadn't been opened since Ryan was a teenager. It was where I kept the old mill records, the real ones. The ones that showed the payouts, the pensions, and the private investments I'd made 40 years ago. I moved the heavy shelves aside, my back groaning in protest. I wasn't as young as I felt when I was angry. I pulled out a metal lockbox, covered in a thick layer of mountain dust. Inside weren't just papers, there were memories. A photo of Ryan in his first suit, a drawing Sarah had made for me when she was 6. I felt a momentary pang of grief, a longing for the children I thought I had. But then, I saw the folder at the bottom. It was a copy of the life insurance policy I'd taken out for Mary 40 years ago. I remembered the payout, $450,000. I'd told the kids I was putting it into a trust for their future. But as I flipped through the statements I'd retrieved from the bank earlier that week, I saw the truth. The trust hadn't been used for future investments. The first withdrawal, 6 months after Mary's funeral, was for $50,000. The memo line in the bank's internal records, which Earl had helped me snag, read, "Consultation fees, R. Sullivan." My son had billed his own mother's death as a business expense, and it got worse. Sarah's design studio, the one she bragged about building from the ground up without any handouts, it had been floated by 6-figure loans from that same trust, loans that were never repaid. They had been siphoned off my grief, cent by cent, while I sat on the porch thinking they were the ones keeping me afloat. I heard a car pull into the driveway. Not a cruiser this time. The low, rumbling growl of a truck that had seen as much work as I had. I walked to the door and saw Earl Thorne stepping out. Earl was 69, a retired private investigator who used to work security at the mill. He was the kind of man who looked like he was made of beef jerky and old secrets. He didn't say hello. He just looked at my face, saw the ripped tie on the floor, and nodded. "They tried the wellness check?" Earl asked, his voice like gravel. "Miller just left," I said, stepping back to let him in. "They're moving fast, Earl. Ryan's desperate. That gala wasn't just a party, it was a coronation. He needed me gone so the Beaumonts wouldn't see where the money really came from." Earl walked into the kitchen and sat at the table, spreading out a fresh set of folders he'd brought with him. "It's deeper than the trust, Frank. I spent the last 3 hours digging into your daughter's firm. Sarah's been listing this house as collateral on her business loans for the last 18 months. She's been forging your signature on equity lines. She's not just waiting for you to die. She's already spent the inheritance." The air left my lungs. I looked around at the walls I'd painted, the crown molding I'd installed by hand on my weekends off from the mill. This wasn't just a house. It was the physical manifestation of my life's work. And my daughter had turned it into a gambling chip. "How?" I whispered. "I have the deed in the safe." "She didn't need the deed," Earl said, tapping a document. "She used that power of attorney you signed after Mary died. She told the banks you were in the early stages of dementia and that she was restructuring your assets for your long-term care. They didn't even question her. She's a pretty girl with a big smile and a Sullivan name. They took her word for it because she looked like a daughter who cared." I felt a coldness settle into my marrow. I wasn't just a father who had been disowned. I was a man who had been systematically erased. I looked at Earl, the shadows of the kitchen making his face look like a mask of stone. "What's the next move?" I asked. "Well," Earl leaned back, a grim smile playing on his lips. "Ryan thinks he's the only one with friends in high places. But he forgets who kept the mill running when the unions were breathing down everyone's necks. You have friends, too, Frank. Men who remember what you did for them when their kids were sick or their mortgages were underwater. If Ryan wants to play a game of optics, we're going to give him a show he'll never forget." Earl pulled out a silver thumb drive and slid it across the table. "I've been tracking Ryan's corporate accounts. He's been borrowing from the Beaumont merger to cover the interest on the money he stole from you. He's over-leveraged, Frank. He's a balloon waiting for a needle. And Sarah, her firm is a house of cards. One audit, one phone call to the right people, and it all comes down." I picked up the thumb drive, the metal cold against my calloused palm. I thought about the way Ryan had looked at Charles Beaumont tonight. I thought about the way Sarah had looked right through me. They thought I was a rustic relic, a simple machine that had outlived its usefulness. "They think I'm senile," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "They want to tell the world I'm losing my mind. Fine. Let's see how they handle it when the crazy old man starts asking where his $400,000 went in a room full of federal auditors." "There's one more thing," Earl said, his expression darkening. "I followed Sarah's car after she left the hotel tonight. She didn't go home. She went to a private nursing facility over in Hendersonville. The high-end kind. The kind with the locked memory care wards. My stomach turned. And she wasn't there to visit anyone, Frank. She was there to drop off a deposit. Your name was on the intake form for Monday morning at tam. Com am. They aren't just trying to take the money. They've already picked out your cage. I stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. The sound was like a siren. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hall. It was nearly midnight. I had 32 hours before they planned to disappear me into a locked ward. Earl, I said, my eyes fixed on the ledger. Call the boys from the mill. The ones who retired last year. I want a meeting in my garage at dawn. And tell Merritt Prescott to have his briefcase ready. We aren't just doing an audit. I looked at the thumb drive one last time before pocketing it. We're going to perform a factory reset on this family. I didn't know it yet, but the biggest twist wasn't the theft or the nursing home. It was the secret Sarah was keeping from Ryan, a secret that was about to turn my two children against each other in a way that would make the gala look like a Sunday brunch. I walked to the window and looked out at the mountain fog. Somewhere out there, my son was celebrating his promotion, thinking he'd finally buried the Sullivan stench. He didn't realize that the man he'd buried was the only thing holding the roof over his head. Let them come on Monday, I whispered. I'll be waiting. The garage smelled like 50 years of honest labor, a mixture of WD bone meal, cold iron, and the faint sweet scent of cedar shavings from the birdhouses I used to build before my joints started to complain. It was the only place in the world where I still felt like the master of my own domain. By am. The mountain air was a sharp, biting blue, and the first of the headlights began to cut through the fog at the bottom of my drive. I didn't have to look at my watch to know who was arriving. In the mill, if you were on time, you were late. The first to pull up was Big Sal, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a hickory stump. He'd been my floor lead for 20 years. Behind him came Tiny Miller, who was anything but tiny, and then a sleek, silver sedan that looked entirely too clean for this gravel driveway. That was Merritt Prescott. Merritt and I had gone to school together before I chose the floor, and he chose the law. They didn't come in through the front door. They knew the garage was the war room. As they filed in, the air in the cramped space changed, growing heavy with the kind of loyalty you can't buy with a corporate promotion or a gala dinner. These men had seen me at my best and my absolute worst. They had carried me through the weeks after Mary's funeral, and I had covered their shifts when their wives were sick. We were a brotherhood of grease and grit, the very thing Ryan had mocked as rustic charm. Frank, Big Sal said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't ask how I was. He saw the ledger on the workbench. He saw the coldness in my eyes. Earl called, said the kids are trying to put you out to pasture. Worse than that, Sal, I said, leaning against my old drill press. They're trying to put me in a cage. Sarah's got a bed waiting for me in Hendersonville tomorrow morning. Locked ward, memory care. Tiny spat on the concrete floor, a gesture of pure disgust. Merritt, however, didn't move. He opened his briefcase and laid out a set of documents that made the light in the garage feel even colder. It's not just a rumor, Frank, Merritt said, his professional veneer cracking just enough to show the anger underneath. I did some digging through the courthouse records this morning. Ryan didn't just file for a wellness check. He filed an ex-parte petition for emergency temporary guardianship. He's claiming you had a violent, delusional episode at the Grand Bohemian. He's listed 3 witnesses who are willing to testify that you threatened to burn the hotel down. I felt a surge of nausea. My own son. My own blood. He wasn't just lying. He was committing perjury to steal my freedom. Who are the witnesses, Merritt? His wife, Jen, a valet who was likely paid off, and, Merritt paused, looking at me with genuine pity, your daughter, Sarah. I closed my eyes for a second. The image of Sarah as a little girl, the way she used to hide in this very garage, just to watch me work, flashing through my mind like a ghost. I remembered the first time she'd lied to me. She was 12. She'd broken a window and blamed it on the neighbor's kid. I'd seen the guilt in her eyes then, and I'd forgiven her because I thought it was just a childhood mistake. I didn't know I was watching the birth of a predator. What does this mean legally? I asked, opening my eyes. It means that at tam. Com am tomorrow, a social worker and 2 deputies will likely show up here with a court order, Merritt explained. If they take you into custody, they'll move you to that facility Sarah picked out. Once you're in, Ryan will be appointed as your temporary guardian. He'll have full control over your assets, your house, and your legal representation. It'll take months to fight it from the inside, and by then, the house will be sold and the trust will be empty. I looked at the men around me. Big Sal was white-knuckling a wrench. Tiny was staring at the floor, his jaw set. These men were ready to fight, but we weren't at the mill anymore. We couldn't settle this with a union strike or a shouting match on the floor. I didn't know it yet, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. But I've been letting them build this trap for years. Every time I looked the other way when $100 went missing from the jar, every time I ignored Ryan's condescending tone, I thought I was being a good father by being a doormat. But a doormat just makes it easier for people to walk into your house and take what they want. So, what's the plan, Frank? Tiny asked. You want us here tomorrow morning? We can block the drive. They won't get a cruiser up here with 20 trucks in the way. No, I said, and a slow, grim smile began to spread across my face. That's what Ryan wants. He wants a scene. He wants me to look unpredictable and violent. We're not going to give him that. We're going to give him exactly what he's been pretending I am. A man who has lost his grip. I turned to Merritt. You said he filed for guardianship over my assets because I'm incapable of managing them, right? Merritt nodded. That's the basis of the petition. Then we're going to make sure there are no assets left to guard, I said. The room went silent. I reached into the metal lockbox and pulled out a stack of papers I'd kept hidden even from Mary. They were the original deeds to a 3-acre plot of land on the edge of the Biltmore estate land I'd bought for a song in the 70s when the mill was booming. Ryan didn't know about it. Sarah didn't know about it. They thought this house was my only equity. This land is worth 3 times what this house is, I told Merritt. And I have a buyer, or rather, I have a recipient. I want you to draw up the papers to donate this land to the Blue Ridge Conservancy effective immediately. I want it gone. No value, no equity, no inheritance. Frank, that's your retirement, Merritt whispered, stunned. My retirement is my freedom, Merritt, and I'm not done. I looked at Big Sal. Sal, remember that old account we set up for the Workers' Relief Fund back in the 90s? The one that's been sitting dormant since the mill closed? Sal nodded. Nearly $60,000 in there, just collecting dust. I'm the sole signatory on that account. I want you to help me move every cent of the life insurance money, what's left of it, into that fund. It's for the men who got cheated out of their pensions. It's not my money anymore, it belongs to the floor. I was stripping myself bare. I was becoming the penniless old man. Ryan thought I was, but I was doing it on my own terms. If they wanted to cage me to get to my wallet, they were going to find the wallet empty and the cage empty of anything but a man with nothing left to lose. But there was one more thing. A piece of information Earl had dropped on me as he was leaving the night before. Merritt, I said, my voice turning cold. I need you to look into Sarah's design firm again. Not just the loans. I want to know about her silent partner. Silent partner? Earl found a paper trail, I said. Sarah isn't just stealing from me. She's been siphoning money from Ryan's own corporate accounts to float her business. She's been blackmailing him with something that happened back when they were in college. I didn't know it yet, but my children aren't just a team. They're a murder of crows, and they're already starting to pick at each other. I spent the next 3 hours with Merritt signing documents that felt like I was cutting off pieces of my own skin. By the time we were finished on paper, Frank Sullivan was a man with a $0 net worth and a heart of stone. As the men began to leave, Big Sal stopped at the door. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a hard, ancient respect. You're sure about this, Frank? Once you sign these, there's no going back. You'll be living on your pension and nothing else. Sal, I said, looking around my garage, I spent 40 years earning that pension. I know how to live on it. What I don't know how to do is live as a ghost in my own son's house. If they want the Sullivan legacy, they can have the grease under my nails and the memories of a father they betrayed. That's all they're getting. After they left, I sat in the silence of the garage for a long time. The sun was fully up now, a pale, weak winter sun that didn't provide much warmth. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. There was a text from Sarah. Dad, I'm coming over tomorrow morning with a doctor to help you with some vitamin treatments. Please don't be difficult. We just want you to feel better. Vitamin treatments, I whispered. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was already practicing the lies she'd tell the neighbors when they saw me being led away in handcuffs. I stood up and walked to the back of the garage, where an old, rusted locker stood. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside was my old foreman's jacket, the one with the Champion Mill patch on the shoulder. I put it on. It was a bit tight across the chest, but it felt like armor. I didn't know it yet, but the vitamin treatments were going to be the catalyst for the biggest reversal of the entire week. Because Sarah didn't know that I had already made a call to the one person she feared more than me, her own business rival, a woman she'd spent 3 years trying to ruin. I walked back into the house, my boots echoing in the empty hallway. The photos on the walls, the ones I hadn't taken down yet, seemed to watch me with hollow eyes. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, the same way I had every morning for 40 years. I was ready. I sat at the table and waited for the clock to strike 10 a.m. on Monday morning. I didn't hide. I didn't run. I sat right in the window where they could see me. At exactly bay, Numwilum, 3 vehicles turned into my driveway. A silver Mercedes, a dark SUV, and a county cruiser. I took a slow sip of my coffee and felt the weight of the gold pen in my pocket. "Come on in, kids," I whispered. "The foreman is ready for the inspection." But as I watched them step out of their cars, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Ryan and Sarah weren't standing together. In fact, Ryan looked like he was about to hit her, and Sarah was clutching a file folder to her chest like it was a shield. The war hadn't just reached my house. It had imploded. And what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about the Sullivan stench. I sat at the head of the kitchen table, the wood feeling solid and unyielding beneath my elbows. The steam from my coffee mug was the only thing moving in the house, a slow, ghostly dance in the pale morning light. Outside, the gravel groaned under the weight of 3 vehicles. This was the moment I'd spent 40 years preparing for, though I hadn't known it. In the mill, you learn that every machine has a breaking point, and every man has a price. I just didn't expect the price for my own children to be my very existence. The knock came at 10 a.m. sharp. It wasn't the frantic pounding of Ryan's previous visit. It was the measured, authoritative rap of someone who had the law standing right behind them. I took one last sip of the bitter black brew, felt the warmth settle in my gut, and walked toward the door. I didn't rush. A man with dementia might be confused, but a foreman is always in control of the floor. When I opened the door, the mountain air rushed in, smelling of damp pine and the cold metallic scent of an approaching storm. Ryan stood in the center, flanked by Sarah and a woman in a charcoal gray pantsuit who carried a leather portfolio like a weapon. Behind them, 2 deputies stood with their hands hooked into their belts, their faces neutral, professional, and terrifying. "Dad," Ryan said, his voice dropping into that rehearsed, soothing tone that made my skin crawl. It was the voice you use for a skittish animal. "We're here to help you. This is Ms. Gable from the county. She's just here to make sure you're safe." Sarah was standing slightly behind him, her eyes red-rimmed. She was holding a small medical bag, the vitamin treatments she'd mentioned in her text. She looked like a grieving daughter, but I saw the way her hand was white-knuckling the handle. She wasn't sad. She was terrified. I didn't know it yet, but she had more to lose today than just my house. "Ms. Gable," I said, stepping back and gesturing for them to enter. I kept my voice steady, my posture straight. I wasn't aware I'd made an appointment with the county. "But please, come in. It's a bit cold for a porch meeting." I caught the briefest flash of surprise in Miss Gable's eyes. She'd been told to expect a violent, delusional man in the middle of a breakdown. Instead, she found a man in a clean foreman's jacket, offering hospitality. As they filed into the living room, the tension between Ryan and Sarah was palpable. They weren't looking at each other. There was a jagged energy between them, a silent argument that had clearly been boiling over in the car. Ryan was the one leading the charge, but Sarah was acting like she wanted to be anywhere else. "Mr. Sullivan," Miss Gable began, sitting on the edge of my old armchair, "your son and daughter have expressed some very serious concerns about your well-being. They described an incident at a hotel recently, a period of confusion and aggression. They're worried you're no longer capable of caring for yourself in this house." "Confusion," I repeated, sitting opposite her. "Is that what Ryan called it?" "I call it a disagreement over a guest list. I didn't care for the music, and I certainly didn't care for the way my son introduced me to his colleagues. I decided to leave. Is walking out of a party, now a symptom of a medical crisis. Ryan leaned forward, his face a mask of faux anguish. Dad, you were shouting. You were threatening the valet. You told Jen you were going to burn it all down. We have the petition, Dad. We just want you to get the care you need. He's right, Dad, Sarah whispered, finally speaking. Her voice was thin, brittle. The doctor is waiting for us in Hendersonville. It's a beautiful place. They have gardens. You love gardens. I do love gardens, Sarah, I said, looking her dead in the eye. Especially the ones that aren't behind a locked gate. But before we discuss my travel plans, I think we should address the vitamins you brought. I pointed to the medical bag she was clutching. Sarah flinched. Vitamins? Miss Gable asked, her pen pausing over her clipboard. Sarah sent me a text yesterday, I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and handing it to the social worker. She told me she was bringing a doctor and vitamin treatments. I find it interesting that a licensed interior designer is suddenly administering medical care. Don't you, Miss Gable? Miss Gable took the phone, her eyes scanning the message. I saw the gears turning. This wasn't the behavior of children worried about dementia. This was the behavior of people trying to sedate a problem. It's just a supplement, Dad, to help with your anxiety. Ryan snapped, his executive polish starting to crack. Ms. Gable, this is exactly what we're talking about. He's paranoid. He's twisting everything. Am I? I leaned back. Or am I just observant? Ryan, you've spent the last week telling everyone I'm losing my mind. But while you were busy telling lies, I was busy looking at the books. I think Mrs. Gable would be very interested to know why my incompetent brain was able to find $100,000 missing from my wife's life insurance trust. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the floorboards. Ryan's face turned a shade of white that matched the mountain mist. Sarah made a small, strangled sound in the back of her throat. That's a delusion, Mr. Sullivan, Miss Gable asked, though her voice had lost its certainty. Is it? I reached into the side table and pulled out the folder Merritt and I had prepared. I didn't give it to Ryan. I gave it to Ms. Gable. These are the forensic audits. You'll see the siphoning began 6 months after my wife passed away. You'll also see that the power of attorney Ryan used to access those funds was signed while I was under heavy sedation for a back injury, a prescription Sarah helped manage for me at the time. I didn't know it yet, but that was the needle that popped the balloon. Ryan turned on Sarah. It was instantaneous. A visceral reaction of a man who realized his co-conspirator had left a paper trail he couldn't cover. You told me the POA was clean. Sarah, you told me he signed it willingly. He did. Sarah shrieked, her grieving daughter act vanishing in a heartbeat. You're the one who spent the money, Ryan. You're the one who needed the $50,000 for the Beaumont buy-in. Don't you dare pin this on me. Miss Gable looked from the siblings to the deputies. The deputies shifted their weight, their hands moving away from their belts. They weren't here to protect a sick old man anymore. They were watching a crime scene unfold. I think, Miss Gable said, her voice cold and professional, that we need to take a very close look at these documents. Mr. Sullivan, would you mind if the deputies stepped into the kitchen with your children for a moment so we can speak privately? Not at all, I said. As the deputies led a swearing Ryan and a sobbing Sarah into the kitchen, I felt a strange, hollow victory. I had survived the ambush, but the escalation was far from over. Because as the kitchen door swung shut, I saw Sarah drop her medical bag. It spilled open on the rug, and it wasn't vitamins that rolled out. It was a pre-filled syringe of haloperidol, a heavy-duty antipsychotic used to treat acute agitation, or, in my case, to make a man look exactly as confused as the petition claimed he was. I looked at Miss Gable. She had seen it too. They weren't taking me to a garden, were they? I asked. Miss Gable didn't answer, but she didn't have to. She picked up the syringe with a gloved hand, her face grim. Mr. Sullivan, she said, I'm going to call the district attorney's office. But you need to know something. Ryan's petition for guardianship is still active in the system. Until a judge vacates it, he still technically has legal standing over your medical decisions if you leave this house. Then I'm not leaving, I said. But the real escalation happened 10 minutes later. A black sedan, the same one I'd seen earlier, pulled into the drive. But this time, it wasn't an auditor. It was Jen, Ryan's wife. She didn't wait to be invited. She burst through the door, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She didn't look at me. She looked at Ryan, who was being held in the kitchen doorway by a deputy. "You idiot," she screamed. "The Bowmans just pulled the merger. They found the siphoned accounts, Ryan. They know everything." She turned her gaze to Sarah, and I saw a hatred there that went back years. "And you thought you were so smart with your silent partner. Well, guess what, Sarah? I am your silent partner. I've been the one holding the notes on your studio. And as of 5 minutes ago, I've initiated a total foreclosure." I sat in my chair, the foreman watching the factory floor go up in flames. My children hadn't just tried to bury me. They had built a web of theft and blackmail so complex that they had trapped themselves. But then Jen turned to me. Her eyes were cold, calculating. "You think you've won, Frank," she hissed. "You think this little audit saves you? Ryan might be going down, but I'm still on the deed to this house. Sarah signed it over to me as collateral 6 months ago. You're not going to a nursing home, Frank. You're going to the street. Because by the time the sun sets, this house won't be yours anymore. It'll be mine." I didn't know it yet, but Jen had one more card to play. A card that involved a debt I'd forgotten I owed. A debt that went back to the very first day I started at the mill. The stakes hadn't just risen. They had reached the breaking point. I looked at the gold pen on the table, then at the woman who had just threatened to take the roof from over my head. "Jen," I said, standing up, "you've spent a lot of time looking at deeds and ledgers, but you forgot to look at the one thing that actually matters in this town." "And what's that, old man?" "The ground you're standing on," I said. I didn't know it yet, but the final reversal of the morning was about to arrive in the form of a man Ryan and Jen thought they had bought and paid for. The knock on the door came again, but this time, it wasn't the law. It was Charles Beaumont, and he wasn't here to help his son-in-law. Charles Beaumont didn't enter the room like a corporate shark. He walked in like a man who had just realized his own house was built on a sinkhole. He was 75, with a posture as straight as a structural beam, but his eyes held a hollow, haunted look I hadn't seen at the gala. He looked past the deputies, past the sobbing Sarah and the sweating Ryan, and fixed his gaze directly on me. In that moment, the air in the living room seemed to solidify. Ryan, ever the opportunist, tried to scramble back into his golden boy persona. He smoothed his rumpled shirt and stepped toward Charles, his voice cracking with a desperate, practiced reverence. "Charles, thank God you're here." Ryan started, his hands trembling. "It's a disaster. My father, he's had a complete break. He's forged documents. He's making wild accusations." Charles didn't even look at him. He held up one hand, a silent command that cut Ryan off mid-sentence. He walked over to the coffee table and looked down at the syringe of haloperidol that Ms. Gable had placed in a plastic evidence bag. Then he looked at the forensic audit I'd handed to the social worker. "I've spent 40 years in business, Ryan," Charles said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that reminded me of the deep hum of the mill's furnaces. "I've seen embezzlers, I've seen liars, and I've seen cowards, but I have never seen a man try to lobotomize his own father to cover a debt." "I didn't. Sarah was the one," Ryan stammered, pointing a finger at his sister. "And I," Jen snapped, stepping forward, her eyes flashing with a predatory light, "am the one who owns this conversation. Charles, the merger is dead, fine. But I still have the collateral. I have the signed transfer of this property. Frank is a squatter in my house now. I want everyone out. Deputies, do your job. Remove him." I didn't know it yet, but Jen had been planning this collateral move for 3 years. She hadn't just been Ryan's wife. She had been his bookkeeper, his enabler, and eventually, his executioner. She'd watched him steal from the trust, and instead of stopping him, she'd used it as leverage to force Sarah into signing over the one thing they all thought was my last bit of value, the deed to this house. I took a slow breath and stood up. My knees popped a reminder of 40 years on concrete, but I stood tall. I walked over to the fireplace mantel and picked up a small, weathered copper key that had been sitting in a porcelain dish for decades. "Jen," I said, my voice steady, "you've spent a lot of time in law school and even more time in high-end boutiques. But you never spent a day at the Champion Mill. If you had, you'd know that a machine is only as good as the foundation it sits on." "What are you babbling about, Frank?" she sneered. "I have the deed. It's registered. It's over. The deed you have," I said, "is for the structure. But in Muknyin Chin Chumbe Mwibon, when the mill was expanding, there was a legal dispute over the land rights in this valley. To protect the foreman's housing, The mill owner, a man who actually valued loyalty, did something called a severance of estate. He separated the title of the house from the title of the soil beneath it. I turned to Merritt Prescott, who had just pulled back into the driveway and was walking through the open door with a leather-bound folder. "Merritt," I said, "tell her about the ground she's standing on." Merritt didn't smile. He just opened the folder and pulled out a yellowed hand-drawn map. "Mr. Sullivan is correct. In this specific district of Asheville, the land is held in a perpetual life trust for the mill's former supervisors. You can buy and sell the wood and the brick, Jen. You can even claim the roof. But the land, the actual square footage this house occupies, is a non-transferable life estate. And according to the original charter, if the owner of the structure attempts to evict the beneficiary of the land, the structure itself is legally declared a nuisance and must be demolished or forfeited back to the trust." The color drained from Jen's face so fast I thought she might faint. Ryan looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Sarah just sank to the floor, her medical bag forgotten as the realization hit her. The collateral she'd used to buy Jen's silence was a hollow shell. Demolished. Ryan whispered. "I'd have to file the paperwork, of course," I said, looking around the room. "And I hate to see 40 years of my own handiwork go to waste. But I'd rather see this house a pile of toothpicks than see you and your wife spend one night under this roof after what you tried to do to me today." Charles Beaumont let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a man who finally respected the opponent he'd been told to ignore. He walked over to me and offered his hand. It was the first time our skin had touched. His hand was soft, never worked a day in its life, but his grip was firm. "Frank," Charles said, "I owe you a profound apology. I let my ambition for a legacy blind me to the rot in my own family. I saw Ryan as the son I never had. I didn't realize he was just a mirror reflecting back whatever I wanted to see. He was a good student, Charles," I said. "He just learned the wrong lessons." "I'm pulling everything," Charles said, turning back to Ryan and Jen. "The trust for the grandkids stays, but it will be managed by a third-party firm in Charlotte. Ryan, your resignation is accepted, effective 5 minutes ago. Jen, your father and I will be discussing your foreclosure tactics this afternoon. I suggest you both find a lawyer who doesn't mind working for a defendant with no liquid assets." What happened next was a blur of shouting and tears. The deputies, realizing the wellness check was actually a criminal conspiracy, began taking statements. Ms. Gable was busy documenting the haloperidol and the forged power of attorney. Ryan and Jen were led out to their cars, not as corporate royalty, but as suspects in an elder abuse investigation. As the cars pulled away, the house fell into a silence so thick it felt like the walls were finally exhaling. Charles stayed for a moment, looking at the old photos on the mantel. "You're a hard man, Frank," Charles said. "I'm a foreman, Charles," I replied. "I just keep the floor running." "What will you do now? They'll hate you for this. They'll tell the world you're a monster who ruined his own children." "Let them," I said. "I've lived 70 years being the good father. I think I'd like to try being a free man for a while." But as Charles left and Merritt started packing his bags, I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was my phone, a notification from the security system I'd installed in the garage. Someone was still on the property. I walked to the window and saw a dark, battered sedan parked at the very edge of the woods, hidden by the hemlocks. It wasn't Ryan or Jen. It was someone I hadn't seen in 20 years. What happened next changed the entire trajectory of my revenge. Because as the figure stepped out of the car, I realized that the siphoning of my bank accounts wasn't the biggest secret my children were keeping. There was a third person involved in this liquidation, someone who had a much older grudge against the Sullivan name. I didn't know it yet, but the mill debt I'd mentioned to Jen wasn't just about land rights. It was about a man I'd fired 30 years ago. A man who had raised his own son to be the silent architect of my family's destruction. I stepped onto the porch, the mountain air biting at my skin. "Show yourself," I called out into the fog. The figure stepped into the light, and my heart stopped. It was a face I recognized from the mill floor, but the eyes were Ryan's. I didn't know it yet, but the Sullivan stench wasn't just a metaphor for class. It was a bloodline secret that Ryan had discovered, a secret that meant he wasn't the only Sullivan heir in this valley. "Hello, Frank," the man said. "I think it's time we talked about what really happened the night the Champion Mill burned down." The escalation had just turned into a total collapse, and the father I thought I was about to meet the man I'd tried to forget. The man standing at the edge of the fog didn't move. He stood with a stillness that felt heavy, like a piece of industrial machinery that hadn't been oiled in years. He was younger than me, maybe in his mid-40s, but his face carried the same deep-set lines of the Appalachian Highlands that I saw in the mirror every morning. And then there were the eyes piercing, ice blue, and identical to the ones Ryan used to stare me down when he was trying to lie about a broken window. "Silas," I whispered, the name feeling like a piece of jagged glass in my throat. I hadn't seen Silas Vance in 30 years. Not since the night the sky over Asheville turned a bruised, angry orange and the Champion Mill became a funeral pyre for the dreams of 1,000 men. Back then, Silas was just a teenager, the son of Joe Vance, my night shift lead and my closest friend. Joe hadn't made it out of the boiler room that night, and I was the foreman who had signed the safety log saying the pressure valves were clear when I knew damn well they were sticking. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Frank," Silas said, his voice a low, raspy drawl. He stepped out from the shadows of the hemlocks, his boots crunching on the wet gravel with a deliberate, slow rhythm. "Or maybe you're just realizing that the Honest Foreman Act has finally reached its expiration date. What are you doing here, Silas? And what do you mean about Ryan's eyes?" Silas let out a short, bitter laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He pulled a weathered, soot-stained envelope from his heavy canvas jacket, an envelope that looked like it had been pulled from the wreckage of a fire. "My father didn't die because of a faulty valve, Frank. He died because you and the mill owner needed an insurance payout to cover the embezzlement from the pension fund. You weren't protecting the workers, you were protecting your own skin. And you didn't just trade Joe's life for that payout. You traded something else, didn't you?" I felt the ground beneath me, the land I'd just claimed was my ultimate protection, suddenly feel like quicksand. I looked back toward the house, where Ryan and Sarah had just been led away. The silence of the mountain felt like it was screaming. "Ryan found me 6 months ago," Silas continued, closing the distance between us until I could smell the stale tobacco and wood smoke on his breath. "He's a smart kid, your son. A bit too much like you for his own good. He started digging into the mill's old archives when he was trying to find dirt on your mental decline. He didn't find dementia, Frank. He found a birth certificate, one that was filed in a different county 3 months before he was born." I felt my heart skip a beat, a cold, hollow thud in my chest. "He found out that Mary wasn't the only woman you were supporting back in the 80s, Silas hissed, his face inches from mine. "He found out that Joe Vance wasn't just your friend. He was the man who raised the son you walked away from so you could marry the girl with the inheritance and the Sullivan name. He found out I'm his brother, Frank, his older brother." The world tilted. The Sullivan stench Ryan had mentioned wasn't about class. It was about the fact that his entire life, his status, his MBA, his pristine social standing was built on a lie. He'd discovered that I had a secret family, a secret son, and that I'd essentially allowed Silas's father to die in a fire I might have helped start, all to bury the truth and keep the Sullivan legacy untainted. "Ryan didn't just steal that money to pay off his debts, Frank," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a death sentence. "He gave it to me. Every cent of that $300,000. It was hush money to keep me from coming forward and ruining his merger with the Bowmans. But now that the merger is dead and you've embarrassed him in front of the whole town, he doesn't care about the secret anymore. He sent me here to finish the job." I looked at the soot-stained envelope in his hand. "What's in there, Silas?" "The original ledger from the night of the fire," Silas said. "The one my father grabbed before the boiler blew. The one that proves you were the one who disabled the alarms. Ryan told me, if I brought this to the district attorney, you'd spend the rest of your life in a cell. He doesn't want your house anymore, Frank. He wants your soul." I didn't know it yet, but this was the rock bottom I hadn't seen coming. My children hadn't just betrayed me because of greed. They had discovered the one thing I had spent 40 years trying to outrun. The truth that I wasn't the hero of the Champion Mill. I was its greatest villain. Ryan and Sarah hadn't been siphoning my money just to be rich. They had been paying a blackmail tax to Silas to protect the family name they secretly despised. They saw me as a hypocrite, a man who lectured them on honest sweat, while my hands were stained with Joe Vance's blood. The weight of it hit me all at once. The revenge I'd been so proud of 10 minutes ago. The land rights, the legal maneuvers felt like a child's game. I had stripped my children of their inheritance, but they had already stripped me of my humanity. I looked at Silas, the son I'd never claimed, the man who had grown up in the shadow of a tragedy I'd helped choreograph. I saw the ice blue eyes, my eyes, and I realized that the Sullivan stench was me. "I didn't start the fire, Silas," I whispered, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "The owner. He told me it would just be a small blaze in the warehouse. A way to reset the books. I didn't know your father was still in the boiler room. I swear to God I didn't know." "Swearing to a God you haven't talked to in 40 years doesn't mean much, Frank," Silas said. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single charred page. "But this does. Your signature on the work order to bypass the pressure sensors. Dated 2 hours before the explosion." He held the paper out. I didn't take it. I didn't need to. I remembered the scratch of the pen. I remembered the fear. I remembered the way Mary had looked at me when I came home that night, covered in ash, and how I'd promised her we'd never have to worry about money again. I'd built a life for her, for Ryan, and for Sarah, on a foundation of charcoal and bones. "So what happens now?" I asked. "You take me to the DA." Silas looked at the house, the grand, sturdy structure that I had fought so hard to keep. He looked at the mountain ridge, where the mist was finally starting to clear, revealing the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge. "Ryan told me to ruin you," Silas said. "But Ryan is a coward. He's a man who hides behind lawyers and social workers. I'm a man who works with his hands, just like you taught me, or would have, if you'd bothered to stay." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, industrial lighter, the same kind we used to use at the mill. "I don't want you in a cell, Frank. That's too easy. A man like you needs to watch his world burn, just like I did." Before I could move, Silas flicked the lighter. He didn't touch it to the ledger. He stepped toward the stack of dry firewood I'd piled against the side of the garage that held 40 years of my life, my tools, and the evidence of my children's theft. "No," I shouted, lunging forward. But Silas was faster. He was 45, and fueled by 30 years of concentrated hate. He shoved me back, his strength surprising me, and tossed the lighter into the pile. The wood, seasoned for 2 years and dry as tinder, caught instantly. A small orange tongue of flame licked the side of the garage, growing with a terrifying hunger. "The land might be yours, Frank," Silas called out as he backed away toward his car. "But the memories are mine. Let's see how much your dignity is worth when it's nothing but smoke." I scrambled for the garden hose, but as I reached for the spigot, I saw the black sedan pull back into the driveway. It wasn't the police. It wasn't Charles. It was Ryan. He'd escaped the deputies, or maybe they'd let him go once the land rights issue made the case a civil matter. He stepped out of the car, his face illuminated by the growing glow of the garage fire. He didn't look horrified. He looked satisfied. "I told you, Dad," Ryan shouted over the roar of the flames. "If I can't have this legacy, nobody can. Silas was the only honest thing you ever created, and even he hates you." I stood there, the hose in my hand, watching the fire climb the walls of my workshop. My tools, the wrenches I'd used at the mill, the drill press that had belonged to my father, were being consumed. The ledger with the evidence of Ryan's theft was inside. The photos of Mary were inside. And then I realized the ultimate reversal. Ryan hadn't come back to watch the fire. He'd come back for the other ledger, the one Silas had, the one that proved the fire 30 years ago was an insurance scam. "Give it to me, Silas," Ryan screamed, turning to his half-brother. "If I have that ledger, I can squeeze the Beaumonts for a settlement. I can get out of this." But Silas didn't give it to him. He looked at Ryan with a contempt that was even deeper than the hate he felt for me. "You're just like him, Ryan," Silas said. "You think everything is a transaction. You think our father's shame is your paycheck." In that moment, as the garage roof began to groan under the heat, I saw my 2 sons, one born of a lie, one born of a secret, facing each other in the light of a fire that had been burning for 3 decades. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge I had planned was about to take its final, most violent turn. Because as Ryan lunged for Silas, the garage wall collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the dry brush behind the house. The mountain was on fire, and for the first time in my life I realized that to save anything, I had to be the one to let it all go. I dropped the hose. I didn't run for the fire. I didn't run for the ledger. I ran for the house, because inside, in the safe I thought was secure, was the one thing Ryan and Sarah didn't know I had. A document that would make the mill fire ledger look like a grocery list. A document Mary had left for me, sealed until the day I lost my mind. I didn't know it yet, but my wife had been the one keeping the biggest secret of all. And the Sullivan stench didn't start with me. It started with her. The heat from the garage was a physical weight, pushing against my back as I stumbled into the mudroom. The roar of the fire was a hungry, living thing. A sound I hadn't heard in 30 years but had felt in my marrow every time I closed my eyes to sleep. Outside, my 2 sons were locked in a desperate, ugly struggle over a charred ledger that held the ghost of Joe Vance, but I couldn't look back. The smoke was already beginning to coil around the ceiling fans of my kitchen, dark and thick as the secrets that had finally caught up to us. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't running into the house to save my memories. I was running to bury them. I reached the study, my lungs burning with every breath. My eyes were watering, not from the smoke, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the realization that my 40 years of honest work had been a hollow performance for a wife who wasn't who I thought she was. I knelt before the small wall safe hidden behind a framed photo of our wedding day. Mary looked so beautiful in that picture, smiling, innocent, the light of my life. I'd spent my life protecting her from the stench of the mill, never realizing she was the one who had bottled it in the first place. My fingers fumbled with the dial. Right muy bon, left high muy high, right chin. The date Ryan was born. The irony felt like a slap. The heavy door clicked open, and there it was, a thick, black-sealed envelope with my name written in Mary's perfect, elegant script. It had been sitting there for 5 years, a ticking time bomb I'd been too afraid to defuse. I tore it open as the fire alarm began its high-pitched rhythmic scream. "Frank," the letter began, "if you are reading this, the truth has found its way out of the ash. You think you protected me, my dear, sweet foreman. You think you took the blame for the fire to give me a life, but you need to know why the alarms didn't go off that night. It wasn't your safety log. It was me." I stopped breathing. The smoke was thicker now, a gray veil descending over the room. But the words on the page were searingly clear. The mill owner didn't just talk to you, Frank. He came to me first. He knew how much I wanted that house on the hill, how much I hated the smell of grease on your skin. He told me that if the warehouse burned, we'd be set for life. I was the one who let Joe Vance stay in the boiler room. I knew he was there. I told the owner he was clear so the payout would be a total loss. I used you, Frank. I used your love for me to make you a fall guy for a murder I committed. The letter fell from my hands. The room seemed to contract. My entire life, every double shift, every sacrifice, every moment of guilt I'd felt for Silas's father had been a lie orchestrated by the woman I'd worshipped. I hadn't been a hero protecting his family. I had been a pawn in a game of blood money. I didn't know it yet, but the Sullivan stench wasn't just my secret. It was the legacy Ryan and Sarah had inherited without even knowing it. They weren't just greedy. They were the biological fulfillment of their mother's cold-blooded ambition. A window shattered in the living room. The fire from the garage had jumped to the eaves. I grabbed the rest of the documents in the safe, the original bank records Mary had kept as insurance against the mill owner, and staggered toward the front door. I burst onto the porch just as Ryan had Silas pinned against the side of the silver Mercedes. Silas was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he held the charred ledger like a holy relic. Ryan was screaming, his face contorted into something that looked less like a man and more like a cornered beast. "Give it to me, Silas. That ledger is worth millions in a settlement. I can fix everything," Ryan roared. "It's worth more than money, you pathetic bastard." Silas spat, shoving Ryan back. "It's the only thing that proves my father wasn't a drunk who fell asleep on the job." I stepped off the porch, the black sealed envelope clutched in my hand. I didn't look like a foreman anymore. I looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and found it lacked meaning. "Stop it," I shouted. My voice didn't have the volume it used to, but the authority in it made both of them freeze. Ryan turned to me, his eyes wide. "Dad, you got it. You got the safe documents. Give them to me. We can burn Silas's ledger and use Mom's records to bury the Beaumonts. We can still win." I looked at my son, my golden boy, who was so ready to use his mother's ghost to line his pockets. Then I looked at Silas, the son I'd abandoned to a life of poverty and shame, who only wanted his father's name cleared. "There is no winning, Ryan," I said, my voice as cold as the mountain winter. There never was. We've been living in a house of bones for 40 years. I walked over to the growing fire at the edge of the porch. The heat was blistering, but I didn't care. I held up Mary's letter. This is from your mother, I said to Ryan. The woman you think was a saint. The woman you used as a shield against my rustic charm. She was the one who killed Joe Vance, Ryan. She did it for the house you tried to steal. She did it for the life you think you're entitled to. Ryan's face went slack. What? No, Mom wouldn't. Read it, I said, tossing the letter at his feet. But I didn't wait for him to pick it up. I turned to Silas, the man who had every right to kill me where I stood. I didn't know Silas, I said. I thought I was the one who failed Joe. I've lived every day of my life thinking his blood was on my hands alone. I let you grow up in the mud because I was a coward who wanted to believe his wife was an angel. I reached into the folder and pulled out the one document that actually mattered. The original, unfalsified insurance manifest that showed the mill owner and Mary Sullivan as co-beneficiaries of the fire. It was the ultimate kill shot for the Sullivan name. If this went public, the estate would be sued into non-existence. Every penny Ryan and Sarah had, every asset Jen was trying to foreclose on, would be seized as proceeds of a criminal conspiracy. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge I'd been seeking against my children was about to be served by the very woman who had created them. This is for you, Silas, I said, handing him the manifest. It's not your father's life back, but it's the truth, and it's the end of the Sullivans. Silas took the paper, his hands trembling. He looked at the document, then at me, then at the burning garage. For the first time, the hate in his eyes flickered, replaced by a weary, devastating clarity. What are you doing, Dad? Ryan screamed, finally picking up the letter and scanning it. His eyes darted back and forth as his world collapsed in real time. If you give him that, we lose everything. The trust, the house, the reputation, it all goes to the state. We'll be paupers. You're already paupers, Ryan, I said. You're just the only ones who don't know it yet. I turned my back on him and looked at my house. The smoke was pouring out of the upstairs windows now. The structure I had spent a lifetime maintaining was finally succumbing to the heat. I felt a strange sense of peace. I had stripped my children of their inheritance. I had stripped myself of my lies. And now, the mountain was taking the rest. But Ryan wasn't done. He looked at Silas, then at the manifest, and I saw the exact moment his mind snapped. He didn't see a brother. He didn't see justice. He saw a piece of paper that stood between him and the life he felt he deserved. I won't let you, Ryan shrieked. He didn't go for Silas this time. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. You ruined it. You ruined everything, you old fossil. I was 70 years old, and my son was in the prime of his life, fueled by the desperate rage of a man who had lost his God. I felt his fingers close around my neck, the strength of his ambition trying to squeeze the life out of the only man who knew the truth. But I didn't fight back. I looked into his eyes and saw Mary. I saw the fire. I saw the end. And then, a heavy shadow fell over us. A massive, calloused hand grabbed Ryan by the shoulder and flung him off me like he was a rag doll. It was Big Sal. He'd come back. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, Tiny and 5 other men from the mill stood in a semicircle, their faces grim and illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. They had heard everything. That's enough, Ryan, Big Sal said, his voice like the grinding of stone. The foreman said the shift is over. Ryan scrambled to his feet, looking at the wall of men, the widgets he had mocked, the rustic relics of his father's past. He looked for a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The fire was behind him. The law was coming up the drive, and the truth was in the hands of the man he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. I stood there, gasping for air, as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. I looked at the black-sealed envelope, now curling in the heat on the porch. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about the fire or the money. It was about what was waiting for Ryan and Sarah in the back of the deputies' cars. Because while we were fighting on the lawn, Merritt Prescott had been busy, and he hadn't just been auditing my accounts. He'd been talking to the one person who knew where all the bodies were buried, not in the mill, but in the Beaumont Empire. Frank, Merritt said, stepping out from behind the millmen, his phone held high. You might want to see this. It's not just about the fire anymore. I looked at the screen, and my blood turned to ice. The revenge was complete, but the cost was a secret that would change the Sullivan name forever. "What is it, Merritt?" I whispered. "It's Sarah," he said. "She didn't just bring vitamins, Frank. She brought a confession, and she wasn't the only one recording that conversation in the kitchen. I didn't know it yet, but my daughter had just played the ultimate card against her brother, a card that would ensure neither of them ever saw the light of day again. The house was falling, the mountain was burning, and the Sullivan legacy was finally mercifully becoming ash. I stared at Merritt's phone, the screen flickering with a grainy wide-angle view of my own kitchen. The audio was tinny, distorted by the crackle of the fire outside, but the words were unmistakable. Sarah hadn't just brought a medical bag to sedate me. She had brought a hidden nanny cam stitched into the lining of the bag's side pocket. She hadn't been trying to catch me being confused. She had been recording Ryan. The video showed the two of them in the kitchen while I was with Miss Gable in the living room. Ryan was pacing like a caged wolf, his face twisted in a way I'd never seen. He was leaning over Sarah, his voice a harsh, low hiss. "I don't care if the dose is too high, Sarah," Ryan's digital ghost said on the screen. "Once he's out and the guardianship is signed, I'm liquidating the Beaumont merger accounts and moving the money to the Cayman shell. You get your 10%, and then you disappear. If you try to blackmail me with that silent partner nonsense again, I'll tell the feds you were the one who forged the life insurance withdrawals. I have the digital trail to prove it was your IP address, sister. I've been framing you for 3 years just in case you got greedy." Sarah's voice came through as a panicked sob. "You wouldn't. Ryan, we're partners. We're Sullivans," Ryan had replied, and the sneer on his face was identical to the one I'd seen on Mary's just before she died. "And Sullivans only look out for number one. Dad was just the battery, Mom was the architect, and I'm the one who's going to finally get us out of this grease-stained mountain town." The recording cut off as a deputy entered the kitchen. I looked up from the screen to see Ryan being led toward a cruiser in handcuffs. He looked at me, and for the first time, there was no mask, no golden boy charm, no corporate polish, just the raw, naked hatred of a predator who had been outmaneuvered by his own litter. Sarah was being led to a separate car, her face a mask of shock. She'd tried to record her brother for leverage, and in doing so, she'd handed the district attorney a confession that linked them both to felony embezzlement, elder abuse, and a conspiracy to commit medical kidnapping. They weren't going to a garden in Hendersonville. They were going to a state cell in Raleigh. I watched the red and blue lights flash against the scorched walls of my garage. The fire department had finally arrived, their hoses hissing as they turned the remains of my workshop into a blackened, steaming skeleton. The house was saved. The fire hadn't breached the main structure, but it felt hollowed out, a shell of a life I no longer recognized. Big Sal put a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You okay, Frank?" "I'm alive, Sal," I said, and the words felt like a confession. "I'm not sure about okay, but I'm alive." Sal looked at Silas, who was still standing by the woods, clutching the manifest that cleared his father's name. Silas looked at the group of mill workers, then at me. He didn't say a word. He just nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that the debt was settled, and walked toward his battered sedan. He didn't need a hug or a tearful reconciliation. He had the truth. For a man like him, that was the only thing that could fix the past. Person, we will see that it in for, with person, with a vi. The following months were a blur of depositions, legal filings, and the slow, agonizing process of dismantling the Sullivan legacy. Merritt Prescott worked overtime to ensure that every penny Ryan and Sarah had stolen was returned to the relief fund for the mill workers. The Beaumont merger collapsed entirely, and Charles Beaumont, true to his word, used his influence to ensure that Ryan and Sarah received the maximum sentences allowed by law. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to see them behind glass to know they were finally where they belonged. Instead, I spent my time in the garage, rebuilt by Big Sal and the boys from the mill on their weekends. We didn't make it fancy. We made it honest. It was during the final cleanup of the old house, right before I prepared to move out for good, that I found the final piece of the puzzle. I was in the attic, moving a stack of Mary's old sewing boxes, when I found a small, leather-bound journal tucked into the eaves. It wasn't Mary's. It was Joe Vance's. I sat on a dusty trunk and read the last entry, dated the day of the fire. Frank thinks he's saving me by signing those safety logs, Joe had written in his cramped, steady hand. He thinks he's playing the game to get his family ahead. He doesn't know that I know what his wife is up to. Mary is a dangerous woman, and she's convinced the owner to burn the place. I'm staying tonight because I've jammed the manual overrides. If it blows, it'll blow small. It won't take the whole block. Frank will think he failed, and that guilt will keep him honest for the rest of his life. It's the only way to make sure Silas has a father who isn't a criminal. I'm doing this for Frank. He's a good man who married a devil, and he's going to need a reason to stay on the right side of the line. I closed the journal, the tears finally coming. Joe hadn't been a victim of my failure. He had been the architect of my redemption before I'd even fallen. He'd seen the Sullivan stench, the rot Mary brought into my life, and he'd sacrificed himself to give me a chance to outrun it. He'd given me a guilt that would keep me from ever following Mary's path. The Sullivan stench wasn't about grease or poverty. It was the scent of a lie that had been burning for 40 years, and Joe Vance had been the one to keep it from consuming me. I officially signed the house over to the Blue Ridge Conservancy that week. I didn't want the wood or the brick. I kept the land in the trust for Sophie, my granddaughter, ensuring that Silas would be the one to manage it until she came of age. I wanted her to grow up knowing that her legacy wasn't built on a merger or an image, but on the soil of the mountains and the truth of the men who worked it. I moved to a small bungalow on the coast of South Carolina, just as Mary and I had always planned, but this time, it was my plan. I spent my mornings walking the beach, the salt air finally scrubbing the last of the mill grease from my pores. I didn't have a mansion or a corporate title. I had a small garden, a library card, and a phone that didn't ring with demands for money. One afternoon, a year after the fire, I was sitting on my porch watching the tide come in when a silver Mercedes pulled into the drive. For a second, my heart seized, thinking it was a ghost from the past. But it was Charles Beaumont. He stepped out, looking older, softer. He was holding a small girl's hand. Sophie. She wanted to see her grandfather, Charles said, his voice no longer the rumble of a titan but the gentle tone of a man who had also found a new rhythm. And Silas said it was time. I looked at the little girl. She had Mary's eyes, yes, but she had the steady, honest brow of a Vance. She looked at me, then at the ocean, and then she reached out a small sandy hand. "Are you the man who builds things?" she asked. I took her hand in mine, my calloused fingers feeling the softness of her skin. I looked at Charles, then at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set over the Atlantic. "I used to be," I said, a slow, genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. "But now, I think I'm just the man who keeps the floor clean." I led them inside, the scent of pine needles and salt air following us. I didn't have much to give her, no inheritance, no Sullivan name to brag about. But I had a gold-nibbed pen and a journal full of the truth. As I sat her down at the kitchen table and began to tell her the story of the Champion Mill, the real story, the one about the grease, the grit, and the man named Joe who saved us all, I realized that the revenge was finally over. Revenge isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about outliving their lies. It's about being the one who's still standing when the smoke finally clears, holding the hand of the future. The Sullivan stench was gone. All that was left was the honest smell of the sea. I looked at the gold pen sitting on the counter, the one I'd bought for a son who never existed. I picked it up and handed it to Sophie. "Here," I said, "use this to write something real." And as the stars began to poke through the coastal twilight, I realized that for the first time in 70 years, I wasn't a foreman, a husband, or a victim. I was just Frank, and that was more than enough.